Okay, you can hear us, but you can't see either of us. Hello, principals. Thank you for tuning in for this webinar to talk about what we're going to do for the mandatory improvement plan process. Sorry again for all the delay and back and forth about getting this final plan to you. I just talked to the attorney for the State Board of Education a couple of hours ago, and she said that the State Board is still going to take up its policy where they want to try to help explain the process, but they're not yet sure how they're going to do that. So they're really still uncertain. So we are just going to move forward with what we had prepared before we were ever told that the State Board was going to do something. So again, this is the process that's just for those schools that are identified as low performing. The process that we're going to use looks like this. So we're going to gather evidence, we're going to evaluate the employee, we're going to make a decision, then we have to reassess the employee and make another decision. That's basically what the statute on mandatory improvement plans says. So we're going to hit on all those piece by piece, but first I want to remind you, what is a mandatory improvement plan? Well, according to this statute, mandatory improvement plan is an instrument designed to improve a teacher's performance or the performance of any licensed employee in a low-performing school by providing the individual with notice of specific performance areas that have substantial deficiencies and a set of strategies, including specific support to be provided to the individual so that the individual within a reasonable period of time should satisfactorily resolve the deficiencies. So what we know from this definition, which is really not that much information, is that it's an instrument. It's something that we would have in writing between the school and the employee. We know that it's something that could apply to any licensed employee in your school. So we're not just talking about full-time teachers. We're talking about all really full-time licensed people, part-time teachers, administrators as well. So this process that we're going to talk about applies to all licensed folks in your building. We know from the statute that when we are evaluating folks for whether or not they need to go on a mandatory improvement plan, we have to use the performance standards and criteria that the State Board adopted. And those are the performance standards and criteria that you're used to seeing as part of your regular teacher evaluation process. So we're not really changing what you're looking at. So we're still looking at whether teachers demonstrate leadership, whether they establish respectful environment for a diverse population of students, if they know the content they teach, if they facilitate learning for their students, if they reflect on the practice, and if they contribute to the academic success of students. If you're evaluating somebody other than a licensed classroom teacher in your building, like for example, a media person, then you're going to use the standards and criteria that are on the evaluation form for your media folks. Same is true with like school social workers, or I guess they're not really in the building, but I'm trying to, yeah, that's true, they're assigned there. So wherever the State Board has come up with that instrument to give you the standards and criteria, that's what you'll be using. So I think you all are familiar with those, and of course if you have questions you can contact Brenda for clarification. Within these standards, we in Winston-Salem in particular think it's important to look closely at professionalism, attendance, classroom management, lesson planning, and EBOS. These are the areas that when we sat down in senior staff, Dr. Emery and others around the table felt like we really wanted to look most critically at for the purposes of this process. So I told you that the process includes these 5 components. The first part is gathering evidence. So what evidence do we need to gather in order to be able to do the evaluation? Because that's what we're doing, we're gathering evidence for the evaluation. So what evidence do we need? We're going to use a combination of evidences for the MIP evaluation. You're going to have existing PDPs for your folks, hopefully. You're going to have potentially some prior observations from this school year. We're kind of guessing some of you got 1 observation, and I know I've talked to some of you who are continuing with some observations right now. So there are definitely those of you that already have done some observations in your buildings. Those observations are good, they count, we want you to use them. We might be doing new observations, and when we talk about observation as part of this process, we are really talking about 20-minute observations, and we'll share with you where those are applicable. And then we're talking about, as evidence, information that are in personnel files from this school year. So not going back, years and years, but really things that have happened during this school year, letters of direction or written reprimands that you might have already prepared for folks. So those are the sorts of pieces of evidence that you're going to be gathering. So remember, we don't have to follow the normal North Carolina teacher evaluation process in low-performing schools. So this gives us some flexibility around how many observations we have to do before we get to the evaluation piece. Unfortunately, a lot of this is controlled by the technology that we use, but we don't want the technology to dictate how we comply with the statute, because the technology is not created for this statute. So we might have to do some stuff to try to override, or we're going to ask the state to help us with the technology so that we can get an override where we need it, or to try to trick the system where we can, because we don't need to be doing 4 evaluations on everybody, or 4 observations on everybody before we get to an evaluation. So we have created our observation requirements that I'm going to share with you in just a second. First, though, so that you can understand why we created the observation requirements that we did, I'm going to share with you what the statute says. The only place where it's really specific about observations is that it says teachers who have been employed for less than 3 consecutive years must be observed 4 times during the year. So 3 by the principal or principal's designee and 1 by a teacher. It is important to note that those teachers who have been employed for less than 3 consecutive years, for better or for worse, that doesn't mean new teachers. I don't know if this was just a mistake in the way the statute was drafted or what, but the way it reads, you could have a teacher who's a career teacher who earned career status in another district and has been teaching for 20 years, but came to us last year, and they're in their first 3 consecutive years with our district. So they would fall under this part of the statute, needing to be observed 4 times. Beyond those teachers who've been employed for less than 3 consecutive years, there's no specific number of observations that are required for other licensed employees. So we've created our own observation requirements, and generally you're going to see at least 1 observation, potentially 2, depending on what you know about the teacher. So here's your observation chart. You'll see that we listed the various licensed employee statuses along the left-hand side, because there's various kinds of licensed employees in your building. In the middle column, you'll see how many observations need to happen in 2015-16. In the right-hand column, you'll see who conducts those observations. So our approach here was to try to balance the need to have good evidence when making a decision versus your actual ability to go and do multiple observations on everybody in your building. So what you will want to do is look at your staff, your licensed staff, and categorize them. Who do you already know is an excellent teacher? Who do you feel already is an unsatisfactory teacher? And then who's there in the middle? You're not quite ready to classify them as excellent. You don't think they're unsatisfactory necessarily. They fall in that satisfactory category. And based on where you classify the teacher, unless they have less than 3 consecutive years of experience, it's going to depend on how many observations you do. So if you have a teacher who you already know is just unsatisfactory, you've had problems with them, when you heard about this MIP process, you thought, oh boy, I'm definitely going to be putting so-and-so on an MIP. It's the teacher that you know really is just not getting it done. You are going to do at least 2 20-minute observations on that teacher. You might have already done them. It doesn't mean that you have to go and do those now if you've already done 2 this year. If you've already done 2 this year, then you're good. If you've only done 1 this year, then go do another one, and you've gotten at least 2 observations. So for those unsatisfactory teachers, we're not giving you a whole lot of criteria around that, except you heard the standards and criteria that we're going by. I showed you the slide of what's important to our district, that professionalism, attendance, and all that stuff. So if you have somebody that's really failing in those areas, they're probably going to fall under this unsatisfactory teacher category, and you're going to want to do at least 2 observations before you do your evaluation. If you have somebody that you already know is excellent, this is your star teacher who has great professionalism, great attendance, good EVOS, that person, you don't need to do any observations of that person. None. You may have already done some, and that's great, but you don't need to do any more. You already know that they're great, and so your evaluation is going to be based on the data that you already have. Then you have that middle person who you're not quite ready to classify as excellent, but you also aren't really sure that they're unsatisfactory. They're just a satisfactory teacher. And for those folks, you're going to do at least one observation before you evaluate them. The reason we have at least on there is because it's up to you if you feel like you need to do more. This is all about your data gathering before you get to your evaluation. So if you feel like you need to do more, then do more. We're just giving you the minimum for these different categories of teachers. For other licensed employees, so for example, for your part-time teachers, you don't have an observation requirement. You are going to have to evaluate them, but you don't have to observe them first. And for school administrators, that for you and your APs, there probably won't be observations, but you'll still need to do evaluations, and we'll get to that slide in a second. So what should the observations look like? The observation should last at least 20 minutes, and you should be observing for areas that you would expect the teacher to be able to demonstrate. You will use the NESA software for your full-time licensed folks, but we'll need the state to allow some overrides, or else Brenda's going to have to do some manual overrides to allow you to get to the evaluation screen without all the requisite observations entered. I mentioned that earlier. So the system is not designed to do this. The software is not designed to do this, and we're just going to have to work with it because it's better, we thought, than the alternative of learning or creating a new system or doing it on paper. So at least with the NESA software, you can go in and continue to do observations the way you've been doing them. We are just going to have to hopefully get the state to allow us to do some overrides to make it a little easier to use. You want to say anything about that, Brenda?
Just that I do think that we can, if we can't override, I can always change them to a category called late hire for some of them that they've not started on yet, observations yet. And that will allow just one observation, and we can get straight to an evaluation. If they've already started and they want to copy into the late hire observation, we can also do that, but I'll send out more information about that to them.
Okay.
To those who would meet that criteria.
All right. So we've talked about the observation or data gathering portion. Now let's talk about the next stage, which is the evaluation stage. The statute says that every licensed employee in the low-performing school must be evaluated at least once each year, and the evaluation shall occur early enough during the school year to provide adequate time for the development and implementation of a MIP if one is recommended. So we've heard this language, and this is kind of the time frame stuff that freaks us out a little bit about actually getting it done. So again, the statute does tell us who needs to do some of the evaluations. It says that for teachers, the evaluation has to be conducted by the principal or the AP who supervises the teacher. If the teacher is in their first 3 consecutive years with us, then you, the principal, have to do that evaluation. For part-time licensed employees, it would seem that the principal or the AP who supervises them could do that evaluation. And for administrators, that evaluation is going to be conducted by the superintendent or the superintendent's designee. And then here's your evaluation chart. So much like the observation chart, we've put the different licensed employee statuses down the left-hand column. I repeated the observation information on here so that you have the same, all of it in one chart. You see your number of observations in the second column for this school year. I've plugged in who conducts those observations. And now we have in the last column, who's conducting the evaluation. So, print this out or keep it near you if you can't remember where the different categories fall, but there's your chart that combines that observation and evaluation requirement. So what are the evaluations going to consist of? Again, we're going to continue to use the NESA software just because it's something that you're familiar with. Like we said a couple times. Oh, Kevin Sherrill's got a whole bunch of projects coming up.
Dismissal.
Dismissal. Thanks, Carol. Yes. We mentioned that we're going to have to trick the system to get maybe to the appropriate evaluation page. but it'll at least be a familiar form that you're used to seeing. For part-time licensed employees, we're going to create a paper form that will just be a one-pager that should be pretty easy to use. And we do want you to hold those evaluations face-to-face with your employees, which you would already do anyway. So you've done your observation or evidence gathering, you've done your evaluation, and then we're at the first decision-making stage under the statute. And this is where you have to decide, are you going to put the employee on a mandatory improvement plan based on what you've seen? Are you going to demote them? Are you going to dismiss them? Or are you going to recommend them for non-renewal? And what the statute says about that is if any licensed employee receives a rating on any standard on an evaluation that is below proficient or otherwise represents unsatisfactory or below standard performance in an area that the licensed employee was expected to demonstrate, and that's kind of some key language there, it had to be in an area the employee was expected to demonstrate, the person who conducted the evaluation shall, so it's mandatory, shall recommend the superintendent either put them on a MIP, move forward with demotion or dismissal, move forward with non-renewal, or move forward with immediate demotion or dismissal, meaning that you wouldn't wait until the end of the year to non-renew them. You would just go ahead and demote or dismiss them at that time. And if you're recommending it be immediate, you're going to have to show that the employee engaged in inappropriate conduct or performed inadequately to such a degree that they're causing substantial harm to the educational environment. If you don't make any of these recommendations, so if you, the evaluator, the principal, or the AP doing the evaluation, chooses not to make any of these recommendations, they have to tell the superintendent that they're not making any of these recommendations. And then the superintendent has to determine whether there's going to be an MIP, demotion, dismissal, or non-renewal. Of course, our preference is you make the recommendation because you're the one who's doing the evaluation. So when you've completed your evaluations, we're going to ask that you notify, just process-wise to make all this happen, you notify Brenda and your assistant superintendent of your decision after you've completed that evaluation. So, I've looked at all these teachers, whether you do it by Excel spreadsheet or chart or whatever, I don't know what's the easiest way to submit it, but you're going to say, I've looked at these teachers and here are my recommendations. Most of them, hopefully, are proficient. And so you're saying they're proficient. There's nothing to do. We're just going to maintain status quo. They're doing fine. But for those that are not proficient, you're going to need to say which of these things you want to do. They're going to hold, after they kind of get that information, they're going to schedule meetings that we envision are probably going to be a lot like your non-renewal meetings, where you're going to sit down, share the evidence that you collected, talk about the evaluation, and talk to you about what that recommendation is. Because if it's demotion or dismissal, you're going to have to get all the paperwork together for that. Or if it's an MIP, you're probably going to end up talking about what needs to go in the MIP. Similarly, the assistant superintendents are going to have to notify Bev of their decision regarding your performance after gathering evidence and conducting an evaluation. So this is going to be going on for all licensed employees in the district. We created a timeline because we know that little piece of the statute about it happening early enough to complete the MIP is making folks nervous, understandably so. So we created a staggered timeline to allow you to work with these teachers in groups to hopefully give you a little bit of relief instead of saying all of them have to be done by the end of January or February. We grouped them by priority. So those teachers employed for less than 3 consecutive years and teachers who you already feel are unsatisfactory, and school administrators, those fall kind of in that priority category. And the deadline to make a decision on those would be February 5th, 2016. So that means you have to do your evidence gathering, which means observations, and your evaluation, and then have that decision by February 5th. For your satisfactory teachers, so the folks who are in that middle category, you get until March 4th. And for your excellent teachers, you get until April 8th, and same with other licensed employees, so those like part-time licensed people. Hopefully this timeline is more doable than having everybody all at the same time, and hopefully y'all understand why we're prioritizing school administrators, unsatisfactory teachers, and those employed for less than 3 consecutive years. So let's say that you go through your observation and evidence gathering, evaluation. Your decision is, I want to do a mandatory improvement plan. You know, they're not proficient. I don't want to dismiss them. I want to do a mandatory improvement plan and see if we can provide them some support. What does that look like? Well, I told you already that it's a written plan between the employee and the person who conducted the evaluation. So it's going to be, you know, between the employee and either the principal or their AP supervisor. It has to include, the written plan itself has to say where this person has substantial deficiencies. It has to say what we're expecting for their level of performance. So what should they have been able to show that they could do? What's the expected level of performance for each of those identified areas? What strategies are going to allow this person to resolve the identified deficiencies? So what strategies are you going to work with them on? And what specific supports are we going to provide that individual to help them with the strategies? And then we need to establish a reasonable timetable for the individual to resolve each of the deficiencies. Where we say specific performance areas that have substantial deficiencies, I think that what we should be looking at there so that we're consistent is a rating on any standard on an evaluation that's below proficient or otherwise represents unsatisfactory or below standard performance in a place they were expected to demonstrate. Now, if you have a brand new teacher who showed up as developing in an area and they're brand new, so you would not have expected them to demonstrate mastery of maybe the subject area, for example, because it's their first time ever teaching this particular class. Yeah, or discipline, Carol's saying. You didn't expect them to demonstrate that area, so you don't have to move forward with a mandatory improvement plan, dismissal or demotion. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, and the assistant superintendents and Brenda will certainly be reminding you about that as we go along when you're looking at your evidence and going through your evaluations. But that in an area they were expected to demonstrate is important so that we don't end up with all of our brand new teachers on mandatory improvement plans. That reasonable timetable, the statute says that it has to be completed within 90 instructional days and cannot carry over to the next school year. So this does not mean that they get 90 instructional days. It means they get up to 90 instructional days. So I don't know that we're going to say everybody automatically gets 90 days. We're going to have to, it'll probably, I think, depend on what you're asking the individual to do, what the strategies are, you know, what you're expecting of them, and then you're setting a reasonable timetable for that person to improve. In some cases, it could be something that's pretty easy for them to improve, like get to school on time, and you have a week to start getting to school on time. You know, they don't necessarily need 90 days to show you they can arrive at work on time. So it'll depend on the person, I think, what you make that reasonable timetable. But at the most, it's 90 instructional days. We have a form for you to use if you decide that you want to do an MIP. There is not a form that exists in NESIS. And again, this is different from the PDP, the monitored plan, or the directed plan. So if you're not going to use anything that's in NESIS, we're going to give you a written form for that. And it's actually pretty short. I think it might be 2 pages at the most. Brenda is asking, is there a final date all mandatory improvement plans should be started? And we've not established a final date to do that yet. Y'all might, when you end up having those meetings, you know, after the February, March, and April deadlines, my guess is during those meetings, y'all are going to say, we need to make sure this person's done by XYZ date. But we haven't actually set one. Reassessment. So after, you know, you've done your evidence gathering, your evaluation, you made that first decision and you put them on a mandatory improvement plan. The statute says you then have to do a reassessment. So it says after expiration of the time period for the mandatory improvement plan, so whatever reasonable timetable you established, the superintendent or the superintendent's designee shall assess the performance of the employee of the low performing school a second time. Interestingly, the statute does not tell us what we're supposed to do to actually assess the performance of the employee. It doesn't say meet and do another evaluation. It doesn't say observe. It just really doesn't say.
Could be a conversation.
Right, yeah, Carol's saying it could be a conversation with the principal. So what we do know is that the superintendent needs to be looking for either proficiency or sufficient improvement. And we know that the results of the second assessment are going to constitute substantial evidence of whether or not they're performing inadequately. So the assessment is important. I mean, we can't skip that step. We have to find some way to measure. And that's why the mandatory improvement plan includes the expected level of performance. When we went through the different things that are in that mandatory improvement plan, I said that we would identify areas of deficiency and also the expected level of performance. And that's really important because that expected level of performance is, I think, what's going to tie back into your reassessment. So one of the questions that the superintendent or assistant superintendent is going to be asking you is, did they meet that expected level of performance in the identified deficiency area, or have they made sufficient improvement toward that expected level of performance? Oh yeah, there you go. I just said what's right here on the slide. The superintendent is going to rely on information that's provided by you principals as to whether the expected level of performance has been reached. And if it has been reached, I think that would be evidence of proficiency, unless you have some other reason why it's not. I mean, it's possible there's some other reason why it's not. This is going to be an individualized decision, but in general, that should be evidence of proficiency. If it's not been reached, then we're still going to consider, well, has there been substantial improvement? And after that reassessment, we are now back to the next decision point that the statute calls for, whether there needs to be demotion, dismissal, or non-renewal. So if the superintendent or superintendent's designee determines that the employee has failed to become proficient or to demonstrate sufficient improvement, then this is where there's another shall. The superintendent shall move forward with dismissal or demotion, move forward with non-renewal, or move forward with, again, immediate dismissal or demotion, not even waiting until the end of the year because this person is causing substantial harm to the educational environment. Of course, if they are proficient or moving toward making sufficient improvement toward proficiency, then you don't have to make any of these decisions. These are just for the folks where it didn't work. You know, the plan didn't work. You put them on a plan, you hope that they meet this expected performance level, but they haven't. So then we are required, again, it's mandatory language. We're required to take one of these actions. There's some really interesting bits and pieces to the statute about what happens when somebody's been dismissed or non-renewed from a low-performing school. And I want to share this with y'all just so that you're aware of it. It's somewhat tied to the mandatory improvement plans, but it's really about the fallout of them. It says that if the local board dismisses or non-renews the contract of an employee of a low-performing school for any reason, except a reduction in force. So for any reason at all, meaning not even if they've ever been on a mandatory improvement plan, but let's say that we had to dismiss them for health reasons, you know, after they were out for a certain period of time and were unable to return to work and they had a dismissal for health reasons. We're required to notify the state board that they've been dismissed or non-renewed from a low-performing school. And then the state board, and every single year, is going to provide all local boards in North Carolina the names of these people. That list is going to get circulated around the state, and it's going to say these are the people who were dismissed or non-renewed from low-performing schools. If we want to hire somebody on what we'll call the list, the person comes into our district on a mandatory improvement plan. So what it says is if the local board hires an individual who is on the list, the superintendent or designee has 60 days to observe the employee, to develop a MIP to assist the employee, and to submit that plan to the state board. It's interesting because it doesn't say, well, what if you observe the employee and the employee's great? Yeah. What does the MIP need to say? Well, nobody said that. They're just assuming you're going to observe the employee and the employee is terrible. That's the clear assumption from the way the statute's written. But that's what it says. So it says you observe them, you develop a MIP to assist them, who knows with what, and then you submit that plan to the state board. The state board is then going to review that plan and may provide suggestions and comments to the superintendent with their staff of 6. I don't really think that that's going to happen, but that's what they say. And then on the next evaluation, and that's interesting language because who knows what that next evaluation looks like when they're in a low performing school and they're on a MIP evaluation cycle. So we're going to have to get clarification on that. But still, let's pretend like we know what that means. On the next evaluation, the employee receives a rating on any standard that was identified as an area of concern that's again below proficient or otherwise unsatisfactory. The local board shall notify the state board, and the state board shall initiate a proceeding to revoke the employee's license. So clearly, very high stakes here for somebody who goes on a MIP or who is dismissed or demoted from a low-performing school. And then, high stakes if you bring them into your school and it doesn't turn out well. So I wanted to make you aware of that. It clearly won't come into play until next year, and that list starts getting circulated by the state board, but it's something that you might just want to be aware of going forward. If on the next evaluation, though, that person is at least proficient on the good things or on the things that were identified, then they get to return to good standing, and the state board will not provide their name to local boards anymore. So they can return to good standing, which is good news, I guess. But I don't know how that process is going to work. So since we don't have to follow the North Carolina teacher evaluation process necessarily in low performing schools, and since the mandatory improvement plan is not a type of PDP, it is absolutely unclear what happens after you finish an employee's observation and evaluations, and they either have been put on a MIP or they haven't been put on a MIP. It's unclear what happens for the rest of the year. So let's say you have this excellent teacher who goes in your excellent category, and you can do an evaluation pretty quickly and realize that you don't need to put them on a MIP or demote or dismiss. Nobody's really given us any guidance on what needs to happen from that point through the end of the year. The state board's proposed policy that they tried to pass or considered passing last month said that you would then go back to the PDP process. That would be a mess because it means that you have to start over with observations again and do another summative, and the system's not even going to let you do another summative. So I had that conversation with the state board's attorney today, and she said, oh, okay, well, so that's good feedback. So we'll see. We'll see what they do on that issue, but it won't work very well to do another summative all over again if you've already done one on an employee. So we're definitely going to need guidance on what happens with folks after you've done your MIP evaluation. And then I think we're almost at the end here. There is some catch-all language in the statute for you to be aware of. And it says, if at any time a licensed employee engages in inappropriate conduct or performs inadequately to such a degree that such conduct or performance causes substantial harm to the educational environment, an immediate dismissal or demotion is not appropriate, then the principal may immediately institute a mandatory improvement plan regardless of any ratings on previous evaluations. So you could have an excellent teacher, somebody who right now you think is excellent, who does something absolutely off the chain in February, and forget about you already classifying them as excellent once before. You can turn around and put them on a mandatory improvement plan if something really crazy happened and they're causing harm to the educational environment. By the same token, you might have a teacher right now who is so far below unsatisfactory. I mean, I hope you don't, but if you have somebody that's already just done something crazy, like let's say last week, then you can forget about having to really observe them. You could go ahead and put them on a mandatory improvement plan. But I know that Carol and Steve would want to talk to you about that before you move straight forward to one, to talk about whether there really is that exigent of a reason or if we should observe them before we do that. So that's the catch-all language. I think it's important to keep in mind. And that's the plan. We're at the end of the presentation. I understand that there is a place on this little viewing thing to ask questions. Hopefully y'all out there know how to do it. Oh, Kevin's going to come tell you how to do it, or you can send them to my email because I have my phone and I can read the questions right now. I think Kevin's coming to tell you how to do it though, if you want to ask any questions.
So they goes in on the question tab, which is in the instructions.
Oh, what?
So they put them in here, because on the instructions we emailed them.
Oh, Kevin's saying that how to ask questions is on the email that you were sent. It tells you how to ask questions. There's a green button on the right-hand side of your screen that should say, ask a new question. You can click on it and type in a question and it'll pop up. But right now we haven't had any questions, and I don't have any on my email, but we'll wait because I think there's a little bit of a delay from our presenting to you hearing it.
Review their email
So-
video to instructions on how to get the questions if they need to.
Okay, so we'll wait and see if any questions pop up, and you can also look back at your email for how to get there to ask questions if the technology is not working for you right now. My mother-in-law just sent me a question, but it's not related. I want you all to know. One just popped up and I thought it might be about this, but it's not. It's from my mother-in-law.
What's for dinner?
No, it's about,
I'm just teasing.
she's not
Not
interested
interested
in
in
our
our
improvement. She's not interested in the improvement
She's
plan.
not interested.
That is very funny.
What role, if any, does the
Amy Nail is asking, sorry, am I supposed to say who? I won't say who. An anonymous person.
No, they see
No,
that.
it's a really good question. What role, if any, does the PDP play? The role of the PDP would be part of your, if the employee, is currently gone through the PDP, it would be part of the evidence gathering at the beginning of the process. I can go back to that slide because that's part of what you can use to inform your evaluation. But beyond that, the PDP is not going to, so right here, gathering evidence, we're going to use a combination of the following evidences for the evaluation, and that existing PDP would be part of that initial evidence. So especially when you're looking at whether or not the teacher is excellent, satisfactory, or unsatisfactory, you might be going back to their current PDP to help you categorize them in that way.
Or if you have already identified some areas there in the PDP.
Yeah, Carol's saying also if you've already identified some areas of concern in the PDP, that's going to help inform you on especially what you're observing for and what you think that employee is expected to demonstrate.
It's just, that was in their instructions, it's fine.
Hold on, I might have, oh wow. Question just showed up on my email. Okay. Question, oh yeah, good question. How are we communicating this to teachers and when are we telling them? That's an excellent question. I don't have the answer to that question. Yeah, we can talk about that on Monday at senior staff. We spent so much time talking about how we're going to get this out to you all. You're absolutely right. We've got to figure out when we're going to communicate this to teachers and how we're going to do that. This PowerPoint is being recorded anyway and posted tonight for principals to be able to view. And it could be just as simple as also letting teachers view this PowerPoint so they see exactly what you've seen. But we'll talk about that Monday in senior staff. Another question. How do we use EVOS in the process? Are we looking for read for 1 year, read for 2 years, same subject, different subject? In other words, what weight does EVOS have? I know that, let me see, I think I showed you, yeah, the standards and criteria here. Dr. Emery did, want to include EVOS, and there was some discussion about if you have somebody who's been read for 2 years, they need to be in that unsatisfactory category. Or there's a strong recommendation that they be in that unsatisfactory category and get 2 observations. So EVOS wouldn't carry all the weight by any means. I think that it's probably going to factor into the process when you're determining, all right, am I evaluating this person under that satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or excellent? Because if you have somebody who has really great EVOS for multiple years, then that's looking more like your excellent teacher. I'm asking Carol, she agrees,
Yeah.
and she's saying she does. Steve is not in here. I think he's watching maybe from somewhere else. But that's a good question, and one that Carol and Steve can certainly help talk to y'all about how you count that EVOS. But I'd say it factors in, at least initially, where you're going to categorize them
consistent.
For,
with what we put out.
yeah, for satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or excellent. Let me see what else we've got here. Talk about the options for principals. If we are rated as satisfactory, we do not have to fear being moved, is the question. So this statute on mandatory improvement plans is separate and apart from the statute about having to make a determination about transferring a principal, demoting a principal, dismissing a principal, or putting a principal on a written plan if you leave them. For this year, because that statute about transferring, dismissing, demoting, or putting them on a written plan, since that statute said all of that stuff had to happen by September 30th, basically, we are taking the position that we can't do that this year. So, right, it's a little easier to deal with it this year because we can just say, look, we're doing this under the mandatory improvement plan process, and the mandatory improvement process doesn't say anything about transferring or putting somebody, that those two aren't tied together. So for principals, the options are really exactly what they are for teachers. Carol and Steve are going to, since you don't have observations, they're not dividing you into that satisfactory, unsatisfactory, excellent, because that's really just about how many times you observe somebody. They're going to evaluate all of you. And based on the evidence that they gather, and probably your current PDP and what, they know about you and probably talking to you, they're going to do your evaluation. And then they're going to determine whether or not you are proficient or not proficient, basically. And if they feel like there's an area where you're not proficient, then they're going to decide if there needs to be dismissal, demotion, or placement on a mandatory improvement plan, or non-renewal would be another option. So the transfer doesn't really come into play here. All licensed employee, the language under the statute just applies to all licensed employees. So as it applies to teachers, it also applies to principals.
And counselors.
Oh, yeah, and counselors and media people, and it's every licensed person in the building. So there's no direct tie to this process and whether you're going to be transferred to another school. The issue is really, are you performing proficiently as a principal or assistant principal? We add them in the mix too. And if you're below proficient on something that you're expected to demonstrate, then you can expect that you might be put on a mandatory improvement plan if you're not being recommended for dismissal, demotion, or non-renewal. Carol, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you said that clear on what the law says.
Okay. So there's a question about professionalism. Do we need to define that for a common language and we're all looking at it the same way? And then a follow-up question to that is, think about interpretation of the subjectivity of principal decision-making. It could look subjective to teachers. Could there be lawsuits? Would a teacher say they just don't like me? So one of the reasons why we're using the standards and criteria that the state board sets out, and another reason why we're using the same software that you do normal teacher evaluations in, is that it's all familiar. It's the same standards, same criteria. Professionalism falls under many of the standards and criteria that are up right now. So establishing a respectful environment for students, demonstrating leadership, reflecting on the practice, all of that is part of professionalism. So we're not creating new definitions for these things. You're using the same standards and criteria that you would currently be evaluating teachers on. So to the extent teachers already say, you gave me a developing because you didn't like me, they're going to continue to do that. That's never going to go away because the evaluation system is what it is, and there's always a subjective component to it. But to the extent that you continue to use your evaluation or your observation instrument and evaluation instrument as you have always used it, and you continue to gather evidence, just like you've always gathered evidence, you're at no more of a risk for lawsuits than you ever have been from the beginning. So I don't think that there's anybody out there that's just going to go hammer somebody because they don't like them. I mean, one of the reasons why we want to use the software that's already there is because it's familiar to people. So I hear that concern, but if you're following the software and what you've been trained to do with it, then I don't think that's going to be an issue. Okay, so this question, if a teacher is on a standard evaluation plan for licensure purposes and required to have 3 observations, but are a satisfactory teacher, do we still need to do 3 or 2? Yeah, if somebody is if somebody for licensure purposes, so their BS1 has to, they're going to fall in that person that's within their first 3 consecutive years. So they're going to be on the 4 observation cycle. So this should not happen. If you have somebody in your school for some reason you think this would come up, then contact Brenda. But anybody who's a BS1 who needs that standard evaluation in order, or sorry, BS1, sorry, BT, I mean beginning teacher who needs to move up, then they're going to fall within those first 3 consecutive years. So the question is, are you saying we do not do a mid-year and end-of-year PDP for anyone? And I realize that is confusing. Yes, that is what I'm saying. You're not doing a mid-year or end-of-year PDP for anyone. You started the year on the North Carolina Teacher Evaluation System cycle, and the second month of the year, they told us that we are using a different evaluation cycle. So yes, right now I am telling you that you're not going to do a mid-year PDP. What you're going to do by those dates I gave you, so whether it's February 2nd, March 4th, or April 8th, I think, whenever those dates were, by the dates that are on the decision timeline slide, you will have done your evaluation. And that's using the summative rating form. So there's no mid-year PDP or end-of-year PDP. On that decision timeline is when you will have finished your evidence gathering, your observations, and your evaluation for each of these different kinds of licensed folks. We gotta figure. So yeah, so no mid-year or end-of-year PDP. I do not have any other questions that have come in, although I'm not crazy enough to think that means you don't have any more questions. I'm sure that there are more questions. I fully expect that because it's a new process. And frankly, it's probably a little bit confusing. We don't want it to be confusing, but it's one that we came up with. And so we certainly have not thought through every possible contingency. Something could very easily come up and you could say, wait a second, this doesn't work for me for XYZ reasons. And if you face that, then please let Brenda know or let your assistant superintendents know, and we will figure out how to address it and work it out. But we hope that with this process, we've at least addressed some of your concerns about how to get people observed and evaluated in a reasonable amount of time. Wait a second. More things are coming up. Okay, so 2 of you have just sent specific licensure kinds of questions. I'm going to get Brenda to, oh, there's more. Man, y'all. I was going to get Brenda to call Dossie and Sarah about your licensure questions. Let's see, this question. What about teachers that are on an abbreviated cycle? Do they now go on standard cycle or can they stay on abbreviated? So again, let me go back. I'm going to pull up the observation slide because we're not worrying anymore about abbreviated necessarily versus full evaluation cycle. The problem might be that you've selected abbreviated, so you're only looking at 2 standards in the software. And that's one of the areas where the software is somewhat limiting what you would need to do under the MIP process. So if you have them on abbreviated and it's only forcing you into 2 standards, then Brenda's aware of that. It's one of the concerns that we've listed that we need to ask the state about, how to fix that in the system so you can look at them on more standards. So I don't have the answer to that yet, except that we're going to have to figure out how to make it work in the software. If your question is about the number of observations, because you have them on abbreviated, you're going to go with the number of observations that we have on this slide, based on whether the teacher is in that 3 consecutive years, first 3 consecutive years, if they're unsatisfactory, satisfactory, or excellent. If a career teacher is in their renewal year but named excellent, then do they need all 3 observations done?
We just employed them first.
Yeah.
They would be a career teacher, so no.
No, yeah, the answer to that question is no. Whether or not they're in a renewal year or not does not play into this. You can still just follow what we've provided. I'm still looking at questions. So the question is, what about summatives? After the deadline for different levels of teachers, do we just do additional observations only for those that are on MIPs? That question is one of the things I was telling you we have to resolve with the state. You started everybody on a PDP, and now we're basically changing that process. We're interrupting that process to do the MIP evaluation process. The state has not told us, and the statute gives no guidance for what happens after you finish this MIP evaluation process. So when you've done your decision-making and evaluation for all these people in either February, March, or April, there's no guidance as to whether you go back to the PDP process or not. So
There's nowhere in the system to do it.
yeah, and there's no way in the system to do it. I'll also tell you there's no requirement that you do it in the statute. So unless the state decides to make that a requirement, unless the state board decides you're going to have to go back and do another summative on the person at the end of the year, then there's no requirement that you do. I've asked the state not to require you to do that because it's a whole nother round of observations and another summative evaluation. I don't know if the state board's going to listen to the advice that little old me has provided or not, but that has been, that they included that in their draft policy. I suggested that they take that out of their draft policy, and I don't know yet what they're going to do. But my recommendation to the state is that they do not require you to go back and do another summative on somebody. Once you've done the process we've showed you today, you should be done for the school year. All right, what else we got? Let's see. I think the only other 2 questions that I have not answered on here are from Sarah and Dossie about license renewal. Let me see, for those who are in year 5 of license renewal, it's the same thing. Yeah. So your license renewal questions, and I think that I actually already answered it with one of them. If they're in a renewal year, none of this impacts it. Basically, if they don't do well on the MIP, then you're going to go down the path of demotion or dismissal or non-renewal anyway. If they do well, then there's nothing else to be done. We don't have to worry about getting in a certain number of observations for licensure purposes, as far as we know. Yeah, except maybe with the BT3, there's a question about that we had on our list to ask the folks at the state, because a mentor is supposed to sign off on their PDP, and we need to figure out how to make that work again in the system itself. So that's something else for the state to resolve. We don't have an answer for that piece now. So this question is, at this point, should we or should we not go into the system and change teachers from abbreviated to full on the My Staff page to bring up all the standards.
No, because we may change some of them to late hire if it's an excellent teacher and we want to go straight to an evaluation. So that's probably going to be more, we need to look individually at their list.
Okay. So Brenda is saying that we don't necessarily want to go in and do that for everybody. It will probably depend on whether you categorize somebody as unsatisfactory, satisfactory, or excellent, or if they're a teacher within those first 3 consecutive, well, they're probably going to be on a full one anyway. But we'll know because you could have some that are career teachers that are.
Correct.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah, we're going to need to see your list, like where if you see the slide that's on the screen now on that left-hand column, we'd want to look at where you've categorized your
Right.
teachers
Then we can move.
and then figure out what to do on the system. Because again, a lot of this involves us making the system work for the process that we're going to use. And so we need to select how to make that work so that you get the full summative evaluation screen that you need without having to force all the observations.
Each of the schools could take the spreadsheet that I've sent them that currently has all their staff on it and currently has whether their career abbreviated or whatever, and just insert another column there. And that way you could just quickly tell me which one of these categories you're putting them in. And then we could help make the best decision of whether we want to change them to a standard or change them to a late hire.
Okay, let's see. I have not gotten a question posed in 2 minutes, and I feel like I really want to jump on that before any more come in. Again, like we said before, we expect that there's going to be questions, and appreciate you asking them because that helps us better tailor the process that we've tried to create here. So, Kevin, do you want to say anything about how this is going to be posted?
We will send you a YouTube link either later tonight or sometime Saturday that'll have the full playback on this. It's got to process for a while, so we'll get it out as soon as possible.
On Saturday, he said. Is that what you said? Saturday?
Either late tonight or tomorrow.
Okay.
Does the presentation go somewhere? So that we print this
Presentation,
stuff?
we can share that too if you like. Obviously the
Oh, yeah.
webinar, but we could send the actual presentation, which you have, if you'd like to send that out, or I could post it on the joint principals.
Okay, yeah,
Haiku
yeah. Kevin will post it on the
All right.
Joint Principals Haiku site.
Right, so we'll do all that either tonight or tomorrow and send you notification that it's done.
Okay, thank you. We're done.
Signing off, all right?
Yep.